যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। যদি আলো না ধরে, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে, যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে, তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে।
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. We are starting our second study with me live stream. 45 minutes, or should we make it 50 minutes? Yeah, let's do it keep it at 45 minutes, and then we'll take 10 minutes break. I'll be studying, reading and contemplating on the Dharma Democracy book by Salvatore Babones, who will appear on the podcast on 25th at 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and you all can ask a lot of questions. He'll be here for about 2-3 hours. Let's see. What I'm wondering is, can anybody keep the timer on? I don't want to keep my phone nearby me because it creates a lot of radio interference, beeps and stuff in the live stream. So when we start, someone please start a stopwatch for 45 minutes, okay? Okay, I'll move the mic away now. By the way, check out this t-shirt. Nice t-shirt. Firstly, it fits me really well. It shows off my physique really well. This is put up a Pomodoro stopwatch. Put up a 45-minute Pomodoro stopwatch. 50-minute. Let's start with 45 minutes now. Or no, let's start with 50 minutes now. Later on, if my mind cannot take that much, then let's keep 45 minutes. This t-shirt is really awesome. This is the group that I'm part of, which organized that ashram retreat in Chinmay Vibhuti Ashram. By the way, this t-shirt has a beautiful thing written in the back, okay? It says eternal by default because it's Sanatan. I really like that. That's why I'm wearing this t-shirt as much as I can. This is very cool. Eternal by default. It doesn't have those cliche terminologies, okay? This is eternal by default. So nice. Okay, let's start. By the way, guys, check out this pen. Royal Albert Hall. Shayak went to UK among many. He has been to UK now many times to give talks and speeches in this legendary university or that legendary university. One of the times he got me this pen from Royal Albert Hall because he went there to watch some orchestral performance or some band, I don't remember. Okay, let's start. Guys, I have to interrupt myself in my विद्यार्जन process to 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 make sense of this. नहीं तो ग्रुप स्टडी का मजा ही क्या है. थोड़ा एक लाइन सुनो, ठीक है? From Stefan Lindbergh, who is the head, he's a political scientist who is the head of that VDEM Institute. Okay, he has defended VDEM's evaluation, hilarious evaluation of Indian democracy, where India's democracy is getting ranked below countries which are not even democracies. Okay, he says India's autocratization process has been well documented, including gradual but substantial deterioration of freedom of expression, compromising independence of the media, crackdowns on social media, harassment of journalists critical of the government, as well as attacks on civil society and intimidation of the opposition. यहाँ तक मुझे फिर भी ठीक लग रहा था क्योंकि this sounds like many non-BJP ruled states as well, because this perfectly fits for West Bengal. अगला लाइन सुनो. The ruling anti-pluralist Hindu nationalist BJP with Prime Minister Modi at the helm has, for example, used laws on sedition, etc. ये बीजेपी एंटी प्लूरलिस्ट है. ब्लेटेंटली ब्रेजनली ये सब बोलने में कुछ तो दम चाहिए. हाँ, दम तो है ही, पैसे का दम है. अच्छा, अब क्या क्या खराबी है बीजेपी और मोदी में कि लॉज ऑन सेडिशन यूज कर दिया जो कि कांग्रेस ने कभी यूज नहीं किया. डिफेमेशन यूज कर दिया जो कि कांग्रेस ने कभी यूज नहीं किया. एंड काउंटर टेररिज्म टू साइलेंस क्रिटिक्स, कांग्रेस ने कभी नहीं किया. The BJP government undermined the constitution's commitment to secularism and continues to suppress the freedom of religion rights. What the intimidation of political opponents and people protesting government policies, as well as silencing of dissent in academia, are now prevalent. Huh. फिर भी we are going on hiring commie sociologists in academia. Lol. Dada put relaxing lo-fi music. डाउनलोड नॉन कॉपीराइट वंस देन. नहीं, स्ट्रीम यार्ड पे बहुत नॉन कॉपीराइट म्यूजिक है. नेहरू ब्रॉट अप ऑन ऑल दीज फॉर या. चलो थोड़ा म्यूजिक चलाता ही हूँ, अगर किसी को प्रॉब्लम होगा तो फिर से बंद कर दूंगा. You're saying is this only part of a larger point he is going to make, or is he नहीं नहीं, वीडेम के हेड का तो यही व्यू है ही. ये उनका कोट देके साल्वाडोर बाबू ने सब इसको डिकंस्ट्रक्ट करने वाले हैं, डिकोड करने वाले हैं कि क्या ये कितना सच है कितना गलत है. ठीक है, तो और कुछ कोट सुने ऐसे. फ्रीडम हाउस बोल रहा है कि इंडिया तो पार्टली फ्री है, जैसे कि उनके BLM प्रोटेस्ट वर मोस्टली पीसफुल. World Justice Project, an offshoot of the American Bar Association, ranks India number 79 out of the 142 countries for the rule of law. Reporters Without Borders ranks India number 161 out of 180 countries for press freedom in 2023. According to Reporters Without Borders, the year 2022, quote unquote, signaled the end of pluralism in the mainstream media. 2022 में ऐसा क्या हो गया भाई मीडिया के खिलाफ? अर्णब गोस्वामी कब जेल गया था? 2022 में ही ना, उसके वजह से क्या? The Washington-based Pew Research Center ranked India the second worst country in the world for social hostilities involving religion. Not from the Hindu side, of course. In 2021, the most recent year for which data are available, and number 38 out of 198 countries for quote-unquote government restrictions on religion. What government restrictions on religion other than Hindu institutions not being able to feed their own and teach their own philosophies in their schools? ये factually शायद ठीक ही है, मगर the culprit is not the ones they think. That's the only hilarious thing. I have to resist talking about each and every fantastic point that comes here. Someday we will discuss this from our membership live streams. So I'll just give one last insane point. The highly respected United States Holocaust Memorial Museum ranks India the fifth most likely country in the world to experience quote unquote mass killings, the main ingredient of genocide. By all this while I was thinking कि अच्छा वीडेम तो उस देश के इंटेलेक्चुअल्स को पूछते हैं कि कैसा चल रहा है देश, और वो लोग बोलते हैं कि हाँ देश लौड़े का चल रहा है, तो वीडेम बोलता है कि ये देश लौड़े का है. तो why are all these other organizations also saying that India sucks? Now I got the answer. That is why I again paused my studying and came back online. Listen to this. Most of the predictor variables used in its models are taken from the VDEM database. तो VDEM अकेला कितना सत्यानाश कर रहा है सोचो. उसके डेटाबेस की वजह से ये बाकी सब लोग बोल रहे हैं कि हाँ इंडिया तो घटिया ही है. ये जगह तुमको नहीं है. The exact specific precise reason exactly why VDM calls India an electoral autocracy, which I don't think grammatically makes any sense. Here's the secret. I finally came to know of it. ये पूरा पैराग्राफ सुनो. हाँ. The headline grabbing electoral democracy index that forms the core of the VDEM is calculated from 23 major indicators. ठीक है, इंडिकेटर के लिए बहुत एक्सप्लेनेशन है कि कैसे कैसे वो लोग रिसर्च करते हैं. Indicators that are mostly coded by country experts, which are combined with general evaluations about countries' constitutions that are made by the project team of VDEM. These many sources feed into 5 main component indices that cover 1. Suffrage, who can vote. 2. Leaders, are they elected. 3. The quality of elections. 4. Freedom of association. 5. Freedom of expression. So I personally don't see India faltering on any of these 5 factors except freedom of expression. उसमें भी कंपेयर टू मेनी अदर कंट्रीज बहुत ही बढ़िया है, मगर कंपेयर टू मेनी फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड कंट्रीज एक जोक है. मगर सफरेज में भाई क्या प्रॉब्लम है इंडिया का. आर द इलेक्टेड इंडियन लीडर्स, इसमें क्या प्रॉब्लम है. क्वालिटी ऑफ इलेक्शंस में देयर कैन बी सम हिकअप्स इफ यू काउंट वेस्ट बंगाल एंड स्टफ, वेस्ट बंगाल, बिहार एटसेट्रा, mainly West Bengal, but I don't think VDM is asking those intellectuals and academics about West Bengal, of course. क्वालिटी ऑफ इलेक्शंस में ये भी हो सकता है कि देखो अगर पॉलिटिकल वायलेंस ही कम हो जाए, जो कि आजकल वेस्ट बंगाल के अलावा बाकी जगह में नहीं होता है, जो कि बाकी जगह में बहुत होता था, तो आई डोंट सी व्हाट्स द प्रॉब्लम विद क्वालिटी ऑफ इलेक्शंस इन इंडिया. अच्छा, अब पैसे दे के वोट लेना, वो रिसेंटली शुरू है केजरीवाल की वजह से, उसमें क्वालिटी ऑफ इलेक्शंस का थोड़ा घपला हो सकता है, बट दैट्स my personal bias, my personal criticism of India's quality of elections. Okay, that's not the criticism that the intellectuals are making or VDM is making, right? They would probably say हाँ बढ़िया है, पैसा तो देना ही चाहिए. अच्छा, 4 है फ्रीडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन. इसमें इंडिया का क्या प्रॉब्लम है, इसमें इंडिया कैसे फॉल्टर करता है, कौन सा फ्रीडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन नहीं है यहाँ पे. हर जगह पे तो एक एसोसिएशन ही है. अच्छा, now listen to this paragraph. This part blew my mind. A complicated but mathematically straightforward formula aggregates these 5 component indices into each country's overall score on the electoral democracy index. This main index is designed to run from 0 to 1. 0 से 1 में ही उनका पॉइंट सिस्टम होगा, ठीक है. With the lowest score ever recorded for an independent country being for Oman in the late 1960s with a score of 0.007, and the highest score being for Denmark in the early 2010s, which was 0.922. There is no formal cutoff for status as a democracy. Democracy का उपाधि के लिए कोई exact formal cutoff नहीं है, but the VDEM regime, quote unquote, regimes of the world spin-off project uses the index score 0.5 to differentiate between democracies और autocracies. okay, तो 0.5 से अगर नीचे स्कोर है तो वो autocracy है, 0.5 के ऊपर से वो democracy है. तो therefore Oman in the 1960s was obviously an autocracy, Denmark was a democracy. अब 0.5 के नीचे इंडिया का स्कोर चला गया, इसलिए हो गया घपला. It is on this basis and not on any direct analysis of leadership behavior. okay, जो लोग VDM का डेटा टाउट करते फिरते हैं, क्या उन लोगों को ये पता है वो इतना एक कॉम्प्लेक्स, सटल, एक नुआंस्ड पॉइंट के वजह से उसका इलेक्टोरल ऑटोक्रेसी नाम मिल गया है इंडिया को. ओके, रेजिम्स ऑफ द वर्ल्ड नाम का एक स्पिन ऑफ प्रोजेक्ट है VDM का, जो VDM का 0.5 का स्कोर को लेकर वो खुद डिक्लेयर करता है कि 0.5 के नीचे अगर कोई 0.5 के अगर नीचे कोई है तो वो ऑटोक्रेसी है, 0.5 के अगर कोई ऊपर है तो वो डेमोक्रेसी है. It is on this basis and not on any direct analysis of leadership behavior. लीडरशिप बिहेवियर का अगर डायरेक्ट एनालिसिस ना हो तो कैसे चलेगा. लीडरशिप बिहेवियर का अगर एकेडमिक्स को पूछा जाए तो अगर वो एकेडमिक्स बिके हुए हैं तो कभी इस पार्टी को बोलेंगे हाँ देश बढ़िया चल रहा है, कभी उस पार्टी को ऐसे ही आर्बिट्रेरीली बोल देंगे कि देश बढ़िया नहीं चल रहा है. इफ दोज एकेडमिक्स ऑल ऑफ देम आर लिबर्टेरियंस, तब तो इंडिया हमेशा से ही बहुत घटिया रेटिंग मिलेगा, क्योंकि दोज प्रोफेसर्स विल ऑलवेज से नो दैट पॉलिटिशियन हैज टू मच पावर. तो इसमें बायस के बिना और क्या मिलने वाला है. तो इट इज ऑन दिस बेसिस, दिस लाइन इज ब्लोइंग मी अवे. It is on this basis and not on any direct analysis of leadership behavior that VDM characterizes India as an quote unquote electoral autocracy. Okay, I'll get back now. Guys, 50 minutes up. I'll take a 5 minute break now. But before that, let me just read out one insane section again. Okay. This will actually answer a question you all were discussing here. Measurement in the social sciences is not a mere matter of pulling out a ruler. It is challenging enough to arrive at an agreed conceptualization of such an amorphous and contested idea as democracy. It is even more difficult to measure it properly. The process of moving from conceptualization to measurement is what social scientists call operationalization. Operationalization involves breaking down concepts into things that can actually be measured, whether directly or indirectly, objectively or subjectively. Obviously, social scientists would prefer direct, objective measures, but often these are not available. Very sophisticated statistical techniques have been developed for converting indirect and even subjective evaluations into well validated quantitative measures, and the techniques used by VDEM are really state of the art. That said, garbage in, garbage out is a universal principle of statistical modeling, and the VDEM data incorporate some very serious but strangely overlooked flaws. The first and most serious is in its operationalization of suffrage, the proportion of the citizens of a country who are allowed to vote. In its ratings for 2023, VDEM gave a perfect score of 1 on suffrage to 175 out of the 179 countries evaluated. Thailand received an almost perfect score of only 0.994, not 1. Why? Presumably because its constitution denies the vote to ordained priests and monks. That leaves only 4 countries without universal suffrage: the UAE with 0.360, Qatar score 0.350, Somalia 0.002, and Saudi Arabia 0.000. Leaving aside the vexed question of exactly how these problematic cases are evaluated, the net result is that suffrage is virtually irrelevant when it comes to determining countries' rankings on VDEM's final electoral democracy index. Since nearly every country in the world gets the same perfect score, an index that didn't include suffrage would return almost exactly the same result as the existing VDEM index. So, what a major insane flaw. The fact that India has genuine universal adult suffrage has no bearing on India's ranking in the VDEM index, democracy index. Can you believe that? I wish I could read out the whole book. Okay, let's take a break now. Yeah. No, Sudip, this is the Martha Sun Temple, reimagined by a group of animators. I took their video without asking them. Uh, I gave them all the credits in the description box in my YouTube channel and in the beginning as well. You might have missed that. I have mentioned the huge list of all the names of the people who animated this. I was looking for some royalty free footage, copyright free footage to make some music on the Martha Sun Temple and its damages. Then I found exactly what I was looking for. They have reimagined it as, let's say, what it must have been like right in the evening before the day of the attack. So I looked at that and made the music accordingly, completely imagining that day, the horrors, the damage, the tragic loss that the priests and the believers around the temple might have felt. So they imagined even an idol of King Lalitaditya Muktapida. It's Muktapida. It's Muktapida probably inside the temple as well. They must have made more. I haven't been following their work. Okay, Neon, start the timer once again. Guys, you all have to do this. प्रोफेसर बाबूनस ने धोती खोल के रखा है वीडेम का. दिस इज अ कंप्लीट एक्सपोज है. दिस इज अ हिट जॉब on वीडेम almost. You won't believe the insanity I'm reading. Okay, I'm marking all these as why question mark, and I've marked 2 paragraphs as simply WTF, what the fuck. And I'll ask Professor Babonis to explain that why does even VDM do these things. Okay, you won't believe this. Listen to this. Fuck. It's a little long, okay, the section I'm going to read, but wait for the conclusion. Your mind will be boiling. So, um, the list of countries receiving perfect scores for universal suffrage include China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Eritrea, and many other countries that don't actually have elections. Okay. Or at least they don't have real elections. As the VDEM documentation explains, the suffrage measure, quote, covers legal de jure restrictions and not restrictions that may be operative in practice de facto. What does it mean? It answers the question, what share of adult citizens, as defined by statute, has the legal right to vote in national elections, even if there are no elections? ठीक है, अगर लॉ में है राइट, तो तुमको परफेक्ट स्कोर मिलेगा यूनिवर्सल सफरेज के इंडेक्स में. ओके, दिस रिफ्लेक्ट्स एट बेस्ट. ओके, ये सेक्शन तुम्हारे लिए रिलेवेंट नहीं होगा बिकॉज यू डोंट नो व्हाट another what's his name, another political scientist, legendary political scientist, Robert Dahl. I'll skip that part. It probably offends most people's democratic sensibilities. Perhaps more importantly, it also complicates the operationalization process of democracy, since it transforms what most analysts would consider the single most important aspect of democracy, the right to vote. It turns that into the least important component of countries' relative rankings. Okay. The second component index, covering the election of leaders, suffers from serious problems. Similar problems. Okay, listen to this. Here, 126 countries receive perfect scores of 1.000, indicating that the chief executive and members of the legislature are elected. India receives a near perfect score, not perfect score, of 0.996 because until 2023, the Lok Sabha included 2 appointed members. Again, there are major anomalies in the scores for this component. Among the countries receiving perfect scores for the election of leaders are Russia and Belarus, though not China and North Korea, because, quote, a popular election is minimally defined and also includes sham elections with limited suffrage and no competition, end quote. Once again, although this operationalization decision can be defended with reference to Dahl's theories, it is obnoxious to most intuitive thinking about democracy. And once again, this operationalization decision makes the election component largely irrelevant to countries' overall democracy scores. Now, listen to the further implication of this retardedness. In fact, among countries that, by more conventional measures, really are democracies, these first 2 components of the VDEM Electoral Democracy Index do not differentiate at all regarding the quality of their democracies. Here's the conclusion. That is to say, all countries that have leaders or legislatures who are elected via universal suffrage get the same perfect score. Yet, these are the only 2 components. Listen to this insane point. These are the only 2 components of the Electoral Democracy Index that are measured directly and objectively: suffrage and election of leaders. Okay, जो 2 चीज सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट होना चाहिए था, जो कि सबसे इरेलेवेंट बन गए हैं वीडीएम के, सिर्फ वो ही 2 मेजरमेंट्स ऑब्जेक्टिवली और डायरेक्टली किए जाते हैं. These are the only two components of the electoral democracy index that are measured directly and objectively. The mathematical consequence of this is that, now listen to this, literally all of the differentiation across democratic countries, okay, in their VDM rankings comes therefore from the indirect, more generally subjective component indices. Okay. तो जिस जिस मेट्रिक्स पे इंडिया खराब कर रहा है वो सारे के सारे सब्जेक्टिव इंटरप्रिटेशंस हैं एंड इनडायरेक्ट डेटा है. डायरेक्ट और ऑब्जेक्टिव डेटा जिसमें काम आ रहा है वो रेलेवेंट ही नहीं है इसके रैंकिंग के लिए. Okay, I'll get back to the book now. सुदीप, यहाँ पे एक सॉर्ट ऑफ एपोलॉजी है वीडम के लिए, but even that is not very relevant. Babonas points this out. He says the universal suffrage and elected leaders components do help differentiate China and North Korea from the rest of the world, and they do result in Saudi Arabia being ranked dead last in the rankings. But these are not useful results. They tell us nothing that we didn't know already. Thus, with two component indices down, there are only three remaining components that determine nearly all of the variability of interest in VDM's electoral democracy index. The third component index, the quality of elections, uses a statistical model to convert multiple experts' answers on 8 different questions into a single index score. The 8 questions cover the completeness of the voter registry, electoral commission's autonomy and administrative capacity, the prevalence of vote buying, violence at the polls, and other voting irregularities, and an overall judgment of the extent to which elections are free and fair, quote unquote free and fair. India scores 0.510 on a scale from 0 to 1, on a par with the UAE, where political parties are banned, and just below Vietnam, where only the Communist Party is allowed to run. A naive analyst might expect meaningful party competition to be at the heart of measuring the quality of elections, but incredibly, the actual competitiveness of elections does not at any point enter into the calculation of VDM's electoral democracy index. Instead of operationalizing the quality of elections in terms of substantive criteria like competitiveness, VDM focuses mainly on procedural criteria. Thus, when compared to Vietnam, India scores much higher on electoral commission autonomy and experts' overall impression that elections are free and fair, but much worse on vote buying and violence at the polls. Of course, no one buys votes in Vietnam because there is no choice who to vote for. In any case, a comprehensive empirical study of allegations of vote buying in India, conducted by the political scientists Pradeep K. Chibbar and Rahul Verma, found that the well-known myths about vote buying in India are just that, myths. India's score on the component index for quality of elections has declined steeply since 2014 when Narendra Modi first took office. Nearly all of the decline has come from a fall in the perceived autonomy of the Election Commission of India. Perceived fall in the autonomy, okay? Which has been compounded by perceptions of increased voting, quote unquote, irregularities, and an increasing perception that India's elections are no longer free, quote unquote, free and fair. Both of these additional factors are sufficiently vague that they may represent spillover effects from the first. That is, country experts may feel that the ECI is permitting irregularities, thus tilting the playing field and making the elections less fair. India's rating on Election Commission autonomy has fallen from a level slightly better than Canada's to a level somewhat worse than in Gaza under Hamas. What? Such a shift, if true, तो कनाडा से बेटर था, वहां से गाजा बन गया इंडिया. Such a shift, if true, would represent a catastrophic threat to Indian democracy. But is it true? उसके लिए हम उनको बुलाएंगे और बाकी लोग तुम भी बुक पढ़ते रहो. So you see what an important work this book is. You see why this person is important. You see where we have to study, where we have to start from in countering this horse shit. Neon. They would say that this index is made up by asking Indian experts only. 70% of whom have PhDs and are employed by universities. तो कहाँ हमने इंडियंस को इन्वॉल्व नहीं किया ब्रो? Neon, good question. I'm going to ask this to Professor Babonas. Please remind me as well, okay? Do note this down. Remind me of this question on the podcast day, 1:30 p.m. 25th December, okay? I think this is a ploy to destabilize the current system of the country because mysteriously this VDM Institute ranking thing started in 2014 only, okay? And until VDM, which Babonas was saying in the podcast we discussed in the previous live stream, he has said this many times in the book as well. Until the 2014 VDM Institute came about, every other historically existing democracy index has repeatedly called India a fantastic democracy. Mysteriously, in 2014 only, an organization comes up, collects data with these insane ways, and in 2017 onwards, they start publishing these indices where they start saying that India is falling and falling and falling, okay, in every metric related to democracy. Listen to this. The VDEM rates the Election Commission of India's autonomy today as being lower than it was during the emergency and dramatically lower than at any other time in India's history. This may be nothing more than a case of historical amnesia. The political scientist Alistair Macmillan describes the ECI during the post-independence period of INC dominance as having, quote, become absorbed into the Congress system of government and lost sight of its broader remit to maintain the democratic structure of the Indian political system, end quote. He details how prior INC governments made serious attempts to stack the ECI in 1989 and 1993. In 2009, as late as 2009, the chief commissioner himself asked that a fellow commissioner be removed from office due to pro INC partiality, a request that was denied by the INC appointed president. Historical inconsistencies like these illustrate the possibility that subjective evaluations might be conditioned on the political preferences of the country experts making the evaluations. Okay, देखो इसे बोलते हैं आर्ग्यूमेंट सजाना, क्योंकि उनका कोर आर्गुमेंट तो है जो इंडिया टुडे कॉन्क्लेव में देके वो वायरल हो गए थे राजीव सरदेसाई को कि भाई तुम्हारे कंट्री एक्सपर्ट्स ही एंटी इंडिया है, बट अभी आर्गुमेंट सजा रहे हैं और शुरू से ही सिर्फ वीडियम चुतिया है ऐसा गाली नहीं दिया है, बोला कि बहुत सोफिस्टिकेटेड एनालिसिस है मगर कुछ फ्लॉज है, अब दिखा रहे कि फ्लॉज कितना इंसेन है. Historical inconsistencies like these illustrate the possibility that subjective evaluations might be conditioned on the political preferences of the country experts making the evaluations. I can't help it. I have to give another dhoti kholna example. Brace yourselves. Are you ready, guys? एक तो सल्वाडोर बार्बोनेज ने बोल दिया है कि इट्स द हिंदू सिविल सोसाइटी व्हिच empowers and sustains India's democracy. Now listen to what he says. It is an article of faith among BJP supporters that India's schools and universities have long been bastions of INC partisanship, or worse, outright communist control. And they are probably correct. After all, the INC controlled India's education ministry throughout the second half of the 20th century, and today's academic establishment is the heir to yesterday's politicized hiring practices. This is not an RSS Karyakarta saying. This is an American sociologist, dispassionate observer of different countries sitting in Australia saying it. मैं बार बार माइक ऑफ कर रहा हूँ फालतू के लिए माइक ऑन ही रखता हूँ Listen to this line. All of a sudden, he is in trolling mood now. In light of the ongoing intellectual war being fought between the BJP and the Indian intellectual establishment, and the alignment of Western intellectuals with their Indian counterparts, it would be a miracle if VDM's subjective indicators did not reflect an anti-BJP, anti-Modi bias. कि ऐसा सिचुएशन है कि यहाँ पे बायस होना ही है. It would be a miracle if there was no bias. भाई सटल सटल धोती खोलना सुनो, ठीक है? ये है सोशल साइंटिस्ट का स्किल सेट, जो कि आज तक ज्यादातर एंटी इंडिया कामों में यूज हुआ है। अब वही स्किल सेट अगर किसी के पास है जो कि अनबायस्ड होना चाहता है, जिसको इंडिया को गाली देने को पैसे नहीं मिलते हैं, वो जब सेम स्किल सेट यूज करता है, तब देखो कैसा सटल अस्त्र घुसा दिया जाता है। One obvious interpretation of VDEM's determination that the Election Commission of India was much less autonomous in the 2020s than at any other time in India's history is that although there have been multiple occasions on which the ECI has been politicized, this is the first occasion on which it has been politicized by the BJP. इसलिए ज्यादा प्रॉब्लम है। No ink droplets. अच्छा, और भी हिलेरियस चीज सुनो। ये जो अभी जो प्रीवियसली मेंशन्ड जो डाउनग्रेड्स मैंने बोला, इवन दे आर नॉट दैट रिलेवेंट। अभी नेक्स्ट जो दो फैक्टर्स है, वो पूरा का पूरा सब्जेक्टिव है, और उसके वजह से इंडिया का स्कोर घटिया हो रहा है। These minor downgrades have had little effect on India's overall democracy score. Much more important are the final two, almost entirely subjective indicators that feed into the freedom of association component. These measure government control over civil society organizations and government repression of civil society organizations. The latter is so subjective that VDEM offers its expert coders several historical benchmarks against which to evaluate countries today. Based on these benchmarks, India's average expert evaluation exactly splits the difference between Mugabe, Zimbabwe, Poland under martial law, Serbia under Milosevic, and post-martial law Poland, Brazil in the early 1980s, the late Franco period in Spain. According to VDEM's country experts, government repression of civil society in India today is more severe than in Saudi Arabia or Gaza, and much more severe than in Pakistan or the West Bank. This is plainly preposterous. Babonis is saying this is plainly preposterous, but it is not the worst example of bias in India's democracy evaluations. Guys, थ्रिलर की तरह लिखा गया है बुक. बोल रहे कि देखो इतना चुतियापा है, मगर this is not even the most चुतिया thing in the index, भाई. Fuck. This is plainly preposterous, but it is not the worst example, not the worst example of bias in India's democracy evaluations. नहीं नियॉन, इस डिस्कशन में अभी नहीं घुस सकता हूँ. Off the top of my head, it won't matter. क्योंकि political parties will find a way to influence elections, student elections. अच्छा, सो मेन जो फैक्टर इंडिया का रैंकिंग खराब कर रहा है वो है फ्रीडम ऑफ एक्सप्रेशन, जो कि अकॉर्डिंग टू Salvatore Babones is very subjective, and therefore how can you even measure it? Although I'm going to ask him this question: why does it have to be subjective? Can't it be objective? If you measure, if you quantify the laws and the application of laws and violation of the law of those laws, can't it be done objectively? It's a naive question, maybe. But listen to this. The conclusion, repeatedly emphasized by VDM over multiple reports, that India and China merely represent different varieties of autocracy, one an electoral autocracy and the other a closed autocracy, can mainly be attributed to this one component of democracy: freedom of expression. What the fuck? Seriously? Open Society is one of the funders of VDM. ওরে বাড়া। কার মেরেছে? There's an interesting comparison between India and Brazil, okay? At number 138 in the world, India's freedom of expression is ranked 16 places below Pakistan's, exactly halfway between Palestine's West Bank and Gaza. It is ranked far below Brazil, which is at number 36. ब्राजील 36 पे है, इंडिया 138 पे है, मगर ब्राजील में क्या होता है सुनो. In Brazil, freedom of online speech has come under serious threat and mainstream publishers have faced mainstream publishers. Okay. Like in India, it would be Times of India, ABP Anando, facing serious damages or attacks from the central government. Okay. The equivalent of that in India. Mainstream publishers in Brazil have faced arbitrary enforcement and potentially gratuitous prosecutions. Similar accusations have been leveled at India, but India's online publishing takedown orders have been more narrowly focused, and its prosecutions of journalists have mainly targeted non traditional news outlets. Listen to the most interesting part now, which is why probably Brazil is in 36 and India is at 138. Another big difference is that Brazil's restrictions have come overwhelmingly from the political left, while India's have come from the right. No, I thought I'm shocking because I thought it would be less blatant than this. रिगर ठीक जगह पे यूज करते हैं ये लोग, हाँ, क्योंकि Babones, who is basically taking their clothes off here, even he has to admit that their methodology is state of the art, statistically sophisticated, मगर flaws है जिसके लिए शायद सोरोस दादू पैसे देते होंगे कि देखो बढ़िया काम करो, 2-3 कुछ चुतियापा घुसा दो जिससे कि हमारा काम भी बन जाए और बाकी काम इतना अच्छा करो कोई क्रिटिसाइज भी ना कर पाए. क्योंकि अगर पूरा का पूरा एक रैंडम ऐसा इंडेक्स होता कि इंडिया 200 पे है और हर कुछ में इंडिया अफगानिस्तान पाकिस्तान से नीचे है, तो और स्टैटिस्टिकल सोफिस्टिकेशन भी नहीं था, ऐसे ही बोल दिया कि देखिए इंडिया बहुत घटिया कंट्री है, तो कोई सीरियसली नहीं लेता. अब तुम्हारा सीरियसनेस का गार्ड फसाड भी बन रहा है. और एक धोती खोलने का एग्जाम्पल, Babonas ji is saying it is reasonable to compare evaluations of freedom of expression in India over multiple decades. India's 2023 VDEM score for freedom of expression is only marginally higher than during India's Indira Gandhi's emergency and much lower than the scores given for the Nehru years of 1950 to 1964. This seems indefensible. भाई धोती खोलने का एक और एग्जांपल तो देना होगा. Now he quotes Nehru to prove that how the hell is India now much worse off during the Nehru than during the Nehru years, and then he quotes all the famous newspapers all over the world of that era who criticize Nehru, who are today criticizing BJP and saying that today's BJP or Narendra Modi is much worse than Nehru. Okay, इसे कहते हैं धोती खोलना, इसे कहते हैं 5 साल का रिसर्च, इसे कहते हैं सोशल साइंस. Listen to this. The emergency speaks for itself, but the Nehru years are much less well known. One of Nehru's first acts as Prime Minister was to amend the constitution to restrict freedom of speech. He did this in 1951, before independent India had even held its first elections, ensuring that he went into those elections with the new restrictions already in place. The First Amendment, which involved, of course, arresting Savarkar for no reason and then forgetting that you have to take him out of prison. The First Amendment to the Indian Constitution 1951 included a quote-unquote statement of objects and reasons in which Nehru frankly admitted that, quote, during the last 15 months of the working of the Constitution, certain difficulties have been brought to light by judicial decisions and pronouncements, especially in regard to the chapter on fundamental rights. The citizens' right to freedom of speech and expression guaranteed by Article 19(1)(a), the Personal Freedoms Clause, has been held by some courts to be so comprehensive as not to render a person culpable even if he advocates murder and other crimes of violence. ये हम कैसे मान ले? In other countries with written constitutions, freedom of speech and of the press is not regarded as debarring the state from punishing or preventing abuse of this freedom, end quote. Nehru's First Amendment permitted the government to impose quote-unquote reasonable restrictions, okay, like subject to public morality. Reasonable restrictions on personal freedoms, including freedom of speech and expression, quote, in the interests of the security of the state, end quote. It was fiercely resisted by the press at the time, with journalists staging nationwide protests. The Times of India editorialized that, quote, Mr. Nehru, once the spirited advocate of civil liberties in India, is now presiding over their obsequies, end quote. The Washington Post editorialized that the First Amendment would usher in, quote, dictatorship in the strictest, most literal sense of the word, end quote. The New York Times called the ensuing Press Objectionable Matters Act of 1951, quote, A repressive code as stringent as any that ever existed under the British, end quote. Under the act, journalists were treated like a quote unquote criminal tribe who quote unquote lived in a state of perpetual terror, according to period accounts, accounts of those that era. 10টা বেজে গেল, এখন আর কি স্টাডি হচ্ছে না। এই চ্যাপ্টারটার দিস চ্যাপ্টার উইল এন্ড আফটার ওয়ান প্যারাগ্রাফ, দেন আইল লিভ ফর ডিনার অ্যান্ড কাম ব্যাক after 1 hour again, for about 1 or 2 hours I'll study, read, and then go to sleep. Kal subah se bhi I think I'll be on study with me podcast, and not study, and I'll do my music production works. आहा हा आहा हा सुनो ये हाँ नींद में थोड़ा टाइम लगेगा नहीं, क्या ब्रिलियंट क्रिटिसिज्म है। Nehru's India under the 1951 Press Act, like Brazil today, gets top marks from VDEM's expert coders for freedom of expression. This final VDEM component index is based on 9 indicators, all of them highly subjective. Is press censorship quote unquote limited or quote unquote routine? Is media self-censorship quote unquote common, or does it occur only quote unquote on a few highly sensitive political issues? Does the media quote unquote cover all newsworthy parties equally at election time? Is it possible to code the extent to which people quote unquote are able to openly discuss political issues in private homes? These are metrics of the metrics of the VDEM index in this context. Okay. These are the kinds of questions that must be answered by VDEM's country experts, whose answers are aggregated via a statistical model to create its freedom of expression component index. This is perhaps a challenge that must be faced, but it is not a process on which a high degree of confidence can be placed. Last line of this chapter. Wherever possible, STEM bros will like this line. Wherever possible, objective indicators should be used to validate these subjective expert evaluations. This is true social science, guys. This is the social science of people like Max Weber. Next, what is the next chapter? Oh, this is just an end of this subchapter, I see. Okay. Okay. We'll take this up after dinner. See you all in another hour or so. Undefined words. Feel karo. Feel what's reasonable. Yes. Thomas Sowell would have had a field day. I wish Thomas Sowell read this book. By the way, anyone, if student elections are banned and everything is done by roundtable sortition, I don't understand what's the point of student unions anyway. क्या कितना स्टूडेंट ग्रीवांसेस होना है? जितना स्टूडेंट ग्रीवांसेस होता है वो सब तो इनकॉम्पिटेंसीज ऑफ जनरल कॉलेज एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन है। उसके लिए स्टूडेंट यूनियन चाहिए भी क्या? स्पेशली इन द एज ऑफ इंटरनेट, सब कुछ के लिए यूनियन के दादा को जाके बोलना ही पड़ेगा, नहीं तो कुछ काम ही नहीं होगा। ये कैसा एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन है कॉलेजेस यूनिवर्सिटीज का? तो वो स्टूडेंट के कुछ प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व करने के लिए तुमको पॉलिटिकल आइडियोलॉजी भी क्यों चाहिए? पूरा का पूरा स्कैम है। Okay, see you at 11:15 or 11:30, okay?
যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। আলো না ধরে, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে, যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে, তবে বজ্রা নলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে। যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে।